a Nixon aide picked up the phone on the morning of June 13, 1971, and read the front page of the New York Times. By the time he reached the third paragraph, he was already dialing the Attorney General. The story had no byline that morning. Just 7,000 pages of classified history, summarized in cold, precise columns of newsprint, telling the American public something the government had spent years making sure they would never read. The study was called History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam, 1945 to 68. The press called it something shorter. The Pentagon Papers, What Happened Next, in the 18 days between that front page and a Supreme Court ruling, is one of the most consequential legal sprints in American history. And it began with one man, a briefcase, and a Xerox machine running after hours in a Los Angeles advertising office. Here is why the Pentagon was scared of what Daniel Ellsberg knew. Daniel Ellsberg was not, by any ordinary measure, a dissident. He had a PhD from Harvard. He had served as a Marine officer. He had worked as a Rand Corporation analyst, advised the Kennedy administration, and flown on combat missions over Vietnam as a civilian observer just to understand the war at ground level. He believed in the mission. For years, he believed in the mission completely. What changed him was the documents themselves. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a classified internal study of how the United States had entered and escalated the Vietnam War. The study ran to 47 volumes and 7,000 pages. It was stamped top secret, sensitive. It was never intended to leave the building. Ellsberg, working at Rand, was among a small number of analysts cleared to read it. He read all of it. What the study showed, in the government's own words, drawn from its own internal memos and cables, was a pattern of systematic deception. 4 administrations, from Truman through Johnson, had consistently told the American public one version of events while privately acknowledging another. Bombing campaigns presented as retaliatory had been planned weeks in advance. Casualty estimates known inside the Pentagon to be catastrophic were described publicly as manageable. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, used to justify the massive escalation of 1964, was documented internally in ways that contradicted the official account in material respects. More than 58,000 Americans would eventually die in a war whose architects, by their own private admission, doubted could be won. Ellsberg spent 2 years deciding what to do with that knowledge. There was just one problem with every path he considered. Leaking classified documents to the press was a federal crime. Ellsberg knew this. He was not naive about what it would cost him. In late 1969, he began photocopying. He enlisted his friend Anthony Russo, who had also worked in Vietnam analysis and shared his conclusions about the war. Russo had access to a Xerox machine at the advertising agency where his girlfriend worked. They came in after hours. Page by page, over months, Ellsberg copied all 7,000 pages of the study. He tried first to get members of Congress, including Senator William Fulbright and Senator George McGovern, to enter the documents into the congressional record and trigger a public debate through official channels. Each of them declined. The political risk was too large. In the spring of 1971, Ellsberg contacted Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. Sheehan had been a correspondent in Vietnam. He had seen what the war looked like from the ground. He understood immediately what he was looking at. The Times spent 3 months verifying and preparing the documents in secret, in a suite of rooms at the New York Hilton, before the first installment ran on June 13, 1971. Nixon's first instinct, according to his own recorded conversations, was to ignore it. The study covered events through 1967. It was Johnson's war, not his. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, pushed back hard. Kissinger argued that allowing the leak to stand without response would signal to every government ally and adversary that the United States could not keep secrets. He described Ellsberg, in terms documented in Nixon's White House tapes, as the most dangerous man in America, a man who had to be stopped at all costs. Nixon moved to stop him on June 15, 1971. 2 days after publication began, the Justice Department obtained a temporary restraining order against the New York Times, the first prior restraint on press publication in United States history. The Times went silent. But Ellsberg had already given copies to the Washington Post, which published its own installment on June 18. The government obtained an injunction against the Post as well. What happened in the next 12 days would determine whether a free press could be permanently blocked from publishing classified government documents in the public interest, or whether the Nixon administration had just handed Ellsberg exactly the confrontation he needed. The case moved directly to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. On June 30, 1971, 15 days after the first injunction, the court ruled 6-3 in New York Times Co. v. United States. The government had failed to meet the heavy burden required to justify prior restraint. Publication resumed the same day. The Nixon administration was not finished. Nixon authorized a covert unit, later known as the White House Plumbers, tasked specifically with discrediting Ellsberg. In September 1971, Members of the unit broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding, in Beverly Hills, searching for material that could be used to destroy his public credibility. They found nothing useful. The break-in was illegal. It had been authorized at the highest level of the executive branch. Ellsberg was indicted in June 1971 on charges of espionage, theft, and conspiracy. The maximum sentence he faced was 115 years in federal prison. His trial began in Los Angeles in January 1973. It never reached a verdict. On May 11, 1973, Judge William Byrne Jr. dismissed all charges against Ellsberg and Anthony Russo with prejudice, meaning they could never be retried. The reason? The government's own misconduct had made a fair trial impossible. Evidence had emerged that the Plumbers had burglarized Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Evidence had also emerged that the Nixon administration had offered Judge Byrne the directorship of the FBI while the trial was in progress, a transparently improper contact with a sitting judge in an active federal case. Byrne disclosed the approach from the bench. The case collapsed. Ellsberg walked out of the courthouse free. He has described the Pentagon Papers case in the years since, not as an act of courage, but as a straightforward obligation. The only thing a person with that knowledge and that security clearance could reasonably do. The Pentagon Papers study was formally declassified and released in full by the National Archives in June 2011, 40 years after publication. It confirmed, in the government's own language, what Ellsberg had said it showed. Anthony Russo never faced trial after the dismissal. He remained an activist and writer until his death in 2008. Henry Kissinger remained in government. He was serving as Secretary of State when Saigon fell in April 1975. Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, brought down not by the Pentagon Papers, but by the same instinct that had set the Plumbers in motion. The conviction that the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to him. Daniel Ellsberg lived to see all of it. He was 91 years old when he died on June 16, 2023. He had spent the last years of his life saying, clearly and on the record, that if he had leaked the papers 10 years earlier, before the escalation, before the casualty counts climbed past any defensible number, the war might have ended differently. Whether that is true is something no document can settle. What the documents did settle is that the men who ran the war knew privately what they would not say publicly. Ellsberg made that gap impossible to ignore. One briefcase, one Xerox machine, 15 days in court, and a war that could no longer be managed by controlling what the public was allowed to read. If you found this story interesting, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked operation or decision from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video. This video is based on real historical events and real historical figures. Some dialogue, interior detail, and sequence of events has been artistically reconstructed for storytelling purposes. It is not a verbatim transcript of any document or recorded conversation. Primary sources include the Pentagon Papers themselves, now publicly available through the National Archives. Neil Sheehan's A Bright Shining Lie, Ellsberg's own memoir Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and the Supreme Court record of New York Times Co. v. United States, 403 U.S. 17, 1971.